Some people wear authority. Others carry honor. The difference is revealed the moment power is tested. Atlanta International Airport was already alive before sunrise, its vast terminals humming with the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and travelers chasing tight connections. Business executives hurried toward security checkpoints with coffee cups in hand. Young families gathered children close as they searched for departure screens glowing above polished floors. Military personnel, tourists, college students, and retirees all blended into the endless current moving beneath bright skylights where the first rays of morning painted long streaks of gold across the terminal. Among thousands of faces, one man attracted almost no attention. Marcus Carter walked with measured confidence, wearing a simple navy jacket over a gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and well-worn boots that had crossed more places than anyone around him could imagine. A black duffel bag rested comfortably on one shoulder, while a boarding pass remained tucked neatly inside his passport. Nothing about him demanded attention. Nothing suggested medals, classified missions, or years spent serving a country that would never publicly know his name. He simply looked like another traveler trying to catch an early flight. Yet there was something impossible to hide. His posture remained perfectly balanced without appearing stiff. His eyes quietly scanned every entrance and exit before naturally returning to the path ahead. Even while walking through crowds, he never bumped into anyone. Years of discipline had become instinct, invisible to most people but unmistakable to anyone who had ever worn a uniform. A little girl accidentally dropped her stuffed rabbit near the moving walkway. Before her worried father could react, Marcus bent down, picked it up with an easy smile, and handed it back. "You almost left your best friend behind," he said warmly. The little girl laughed, hugged the toy tightly, and waved as Marcus continued on without waiting for thanks. Several nearby travelers smiled at the small act of kindness before returning to their own routines. Not everyone saw the same moment through the same eyes. Officer Ethan Brooks leaned casually against a security barrier near the TSA entrance, watching passengers flow through the terminal. After nearly 12 years on the force, he trusted his instincts more than procedures, and lately those instincts had become mixed with assumptions he rarely questioned. His attention settled on Marcus almost immediately. "Interesting," he muttered under his breath as he watched Marcus disappear briefly into the security line. There was nothing illegal happening. Nothing suspicious had actually occurred. Yet Brooks continued watching anyway, convinced there had to be something he hadn't seen yet. Beside him, Airport Security Supervisor Sarah Collins glanced toward Marcus before returning to her tablet. "Everything looks normal," she said without concern. Brooks shrugged with a faint smirk. "We'll see." Marcus reached the screening area and patiently waited his turn like everyone else. He removed his watch, placed his phone inside a tray, and thanked the TSA officer who directed him forward. Calm, respectful, efficient. The line continued moving smoothly until Brooks stepped away from the barrier and positioned himself directly in Marcus's path. Conversations nearby softened. Travelers naturally slowed, sensing that something unexpected might unfold. Brooks folded his arms and looked Marcus up and down with a smile that carried more judgment than humor. "Big hurry today?" he asked loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. Marcus answered with the same steady tone he had used moments earlier with the little girl. "Just trying to make my flight, officer." Brooks chuckled. "Funny. Guys like you always seem to have somewhere important to be." A few uncomfortable glances passed between strangers standing nearby. Marcus remained composed. "Is there a problem?" Brooks tilted his head, still smiling. "Maybe. Maybe not. Depends on what I find." Marcus gave a slight nod. "Then I'll cooperate however you need." The answer almost seemed to disappoint Brooks. He had expected irritation, maybe even an argument. Instead, he found patience, and somehow that made him even more determined to keep pushing. Around them, phones slowly began appearing in curious hands. Not because anyone expected history to unfold, but because people recognized the unmistakable tension that sometimes arrives just before an ordinary morning becomes something no one will ever forget. None of them realized that before this day was over, the airport itself would pause, powerful officials would arrive without warning, and the man standing quietly before Officer Brooks would become the one person in the terminal everyone wished they had recognized from the very beginning. Marcus Carter did not move until Officer Ethan Brooks finished speaking. He simply met the officer's eyes with the same calm expression that had carried him through years of situations where patience mattered more than pride. Around them, the security line slowed as travelers quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody wanted to interfere, yet almost everyone sensed that the conversation had become something more than a routine security check. Brooks stepped closer and looked at Marcus's boarding pass without reaching for it. "Business or vacation?" he asked with a tone that sounded more like an interrogation than casual conversation. Marcus answered honestly, "Government travel." Brooks gave a short laugh. "Government, huh? Everybody claims that these days." Marcus nodded politely. "You are welcome to verify whatever information you need." The response carried no irritation, no sarcasm, and no challenge. It was the voice of someone who understood procedures and respected them. Somehow, that professionalism only seemed to fuel Brooks's determination. "Set your bag over there," he ordered, pointing toward a nearby inspection table. Marcus placed the duffel bag exactly where instructed and stepped back with his hands visible. Several Transportation Security Administration officers noticed that he followed every instruction before it was fully spoken, a habit common among experienced service members. One younger officer quietly whispered to a colleague, "He seems more cooperative than half the passengers we process every morning." Sarah Collins continued observing from several yards away. She had managed airport security operations long enough to recognize when routine interactions began drifting into unnecessary territory. Brooks had not violated any policy, but his tone had clearly changed the atmosphere. Families waiting nearby grew silent. Business travelers checked their watches yet remained where they stood, curiosity replacing impatience. Marcus remained completely composed. His breathing never changed. His shoulders stayed relaxed. Every movement appeared deliberate, controlled, almost effortless. Brooks unzipped the duffel bag and examined its neatly organized contents. Folded clothing, running shoes, a paperback novel with several pages marked, a refillable water bottle. Nothing unusual. He searched another compartment and discovered only travel documents, a notebook, and a carefully packed toiletry bag. Nothing explained the suspicion Brooks had already convinced himself was justified. "Traveling light," Brooks commented. "Only bringing what I need," Marcus replied. Brooks noticed a small challenge coin resting inside a side pocket. He held it up between two fingers, studying the unfamiliar military emblem engraved across its surface. "What is this supposed to be?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "A unit coin." Brooks turned it over once before dropping it back into the bag. "Anybody can buy military souvenirs online." Marcus simply responded, "That is true." The quiet confidence behind those words created an awkward pause. Brooks seemed to be waiting for an emotional reaction that never came. Nearby, an elderly veteran wearing a United States Army cap watched the exchange with growing concern. His eyes briefly settled on Marcus's posture, then on the challenge coin, then back to the officer. He frowned slightly, but remained silent. Experience had taught him that appearances often hid remarkable stories. Brooks circled around Marcus once more. "You know, most people get nervous when a police officer starts asking questions." Marcus answered with complete sincerity. "Most officers are simply doing their jobs." "And what do you think I am doing?" Brooks asked. Marcus looked directly at him before replying. "I believe that depends on what happens next." The sentence was respectful, yet it lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Sarah Collins looked up from her tablet again. Something about Marcus's composure felt strangely familiar. She had worked alongside military security teams during emergency preparedness exercises, and his quiet discipline reminded her of people who carried enormous responsibility without ever mentioning it. She glanced toward one of the airport operations monitors, then back toward the inspection area, making a mental note to remain nearby. Brooks folded his arms once again, convinced he had not reached the end of this encounter. He could not explain why, but he refused to believe the calm traveler standing before him was exactly who he appeared to be. What Brooks failed to understand was that Marcus had spent an entire career allowing others to underestimate him. In his world, the loudest person in the room was rarely the strongest. The most important work often happened without applause, without recognition, and without anyone ever learning the names of those who made impossible missions succeed. As another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Marcus briefly glanced toward the departure board, calculating the minutes remaining before his flight. He had no idea that missing the airplane was about to become the smallest concern anyone in the terminal would have. Officer Ethan Brooks let the silence stretch just long enough to make every pair of nearby eyes drift back toward him. The terminal continued moving around them, but inside the inspection area, time seemed to slow. Boarding announcements echoed overhead, while rolling suitcases crossed polished floors. Yet the growing circle of curious travelers remained focused on one calm passenger who had done nothing except cooperate. Brooks reached for Marcus Carter's passport again, flipping through its pages with exaggerated care. "You travel quite a bit," he observed. Marcus answered evenly. "My work requires it." Brooks looked up with a skeptical smile. "Government work, right?" Marcus simply nodded. "Yes, sir." The respectful answer seemed to frustrate Brooks even more. Every question he asked was met with patience instead of resistance. Every attempt to provoke an argument quietly dissolved before it could begin. Sarah Collins noticed several people lifting their phones, not dramatically, but cautiously, recording because they sensed the interaction was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. She walked several steps closer without interrupting, choosing instead to observe carefully before making any decision. Brooks handed the passport back, but did not step aside. "I still have questions," he said. Marcus accepted the document and replied, "I will answer whatever I legally can." Brooks tilted his head. "Legally can?" Marcus remained composed. "Some information is not mine to discuss." The answer immediately caught the attention of several nearby travelers. It sounded unusual, yet it was delivered without arrogance. Brooks laughed loudly enough for people standing in line to hear. "That sounds like something from a movie." Marcus offered a small, polite smile, but said nothing else. Brooks folded his arms. "Tell me exactly what department you work for." Marcus answered after a brief pause. "I am traveling under official authorization." "That is not what I asked." "It is the most complete answer I am allowed to provide." Brooks shook his head. "Convenient." Marcus did not respond. The older Army veteran who had been quietly watching finally stepped forward a few feet. He spoke calmly, addressing Brooks with respect. "Officer, the gentleman has cooperated the entire time." Brooks glanced toward him without changing expression. "Sir, I know how to do my job." The veteran nodded once and stepped back without arguing. He had spent enough years wearing a uniform to recognize that forcing the conversation further would accomplish nothing. Marcus looked toward the veteran and gave a subtle nod of appreciation before returning his attention to Brooks. There was no anger in his face, only remarkable patience. Sarah Collins noticed another detail she had overlooked earlier. Marcus never once glanced around searching for help. He never attempted to persuade the crowd to take his side. He behaved like someone who had complete confidence that facts would eventually speak for themselves. Brooks pointed toward another inspection table several feet away. "Move over there." Marcus immediately complied. Brooks continued asking routine questions that slowly became increasingly personal. Where had Marcus been? Who had he met? Why was his itinerary unusually short? Marcus answered each permissible question honestly and respectfully. When a question involved protected information, he simply replied, "I cannot discuss that." There was never hesitation, only consistency. A Transportation Security Administration supervisor quietly reviewed the identification Marcus had already presented. Although nothing appeared improper, one line of authorization caught his attention. It was marked with a classification code he had rarely encountered. He looked at it again, frowned slightly, and decided not to comment until verifying what it meant. Brooks, unaware of the supervisor's growing concern, continued pressing forward. "You expect me to believe that everything about you is classified?" Marcus shook his head gently. "No, sir. Only the parts that belong to the people I serve." The sentence lingered in the air. It was not defensive. It was not dramatic. It was simply true. Several travelers exchanged quiet looks. Even those who knew nothing about military service could hear the sincerity behind his words. Brooks looked unconvinced. To him, Marcus's calmness no longer appeared cooperative. It looked calculated. The officer had become so committed to his first impression that every new piece of information only reinforced the conclusion he had already reached. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins noticed the Transportation Security Administration supervisor walking quickly toward the operations office with a copy of the travel authorization. He did not appear alarmed, but he certainly appeared concerned. As Marcus stood patiently beside his duffel bag, Another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. His flight had begun boarding, yet he made no attempt to leave. He simply waited, knowing that some journeys required far more patience than the one printed on his boarding pass. Marcus Carter quietly watched another boarding group appear on the departure screen across the terminal, but his attention returned almost immediately to Officer Ethan Brooks. Missing a flight could be fixed. Losing patience could not. Years of service had taught him that discipline was measured most clearly when someone else tried to take it away. Around them, the atmosphere continued to change. The curious whispers had become cautious silence. Travelers who had originally paused for only a few seconds now remained nearby, pretending to organize carry-on bags or check flight updates while secretly watching every word exchanged between the calm passenger and the increasingly determined officer. Sarah Collins noticed the same shift. She had seen hundreds of security inspections over the years, and the ones that lasted this long almost always involved clear evidence of wrongdoing or an obvious safety concern. This situation felt different. The facts remained ordinary, but the tension kept growing. Meanwhile, inside the airport operations office, the Transportation Security Administration supervisor carefully entered the authorization code from Marcus's travel documents into a secure government verification system. The first search returned only a restricted access notice. He tried again, believing he had mistyped the number. The same message appeared. Instead of displaying the usual verification information, the screen instructed authorized personnel to contact a federal liaison through a dedicated number. The supervisor frowned. He had processed thousands of official travelers over the years, but he had only encountered that instruction once before. He immediately picked up the secure phone without drawing attention to himself. Back at the inspection area, Brooks continued studying Marcus with growing suspicion. "You have been unusually calm through all of this," he said. Marcus answered honestly. "Getting upset rarely improves a situation." Brooks smiled faintly. "Or maybe you have practiced this before." Marcus did not react to the implication. "I have spent many years learning to stay calm under pressure." Brooks laughed quietly. "That sounds rehearsed." Marcus replied, "Experience often does." Several people nearby exchanged another look. The older Army veteran slowly nodded to himself after hearing those words. There was something unmistakable about the way Marcus chose every sentence. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was emotional. Every answer sounded like someone trained to think before speaking. Brooks reached toward the inspection table and picked up the small challenge coin once more. This time he examined it more carefully. The engraving was worn from years of carrying it, not polished like a souvenir purchased from a gift shop. Along one edge were tiny initials, almost impossible to notice without looking closely. Brooks turned it over several times before placing it back down with a dismissive shrug. "Interesting keepsake," he remarked. Marcus looked at the coin for only a moment before replying. "It reminds me of people who earned more respect than recognition." Brooks folded his arms again, clearly unimpressed. "You really enjoy talking in riddles." Marcus answered, "No, sir. I simply choose my words carefully." At nearly the same moment, Sarah Collins noticed something she had overlooked since the interaction began. Marcus never once checked his phone, even though he had already missed the start of boarding. Most passengers would have become anxious, frustrated, or impatient. Marcus remained completely focused on the people in front of him, as though he trusted that wherever he needed to be would still be waiting when the time came. That quiet confidence made Sarah even more uneasy. Inside the operations office, the secure telephone finally connected. The Transportation Security Administration supervisor introduced himself and carefully read the authorization number exactly as it appeared on Marcus's documents. There was a long pause. Then the supervisor's expression changed completely. He straightened in his chair and instinctively lowered his voice. "Understood," he replied. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." When the call ended, he remained motionless for several seconds before immediately walking towards Sarah Collins with unusual urgency. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. Yet every step carried a seriousness that could not be mistaken. Sarah met him halfway. He leaned closer and quietly spoke only a few words. Her eyes widened almost instantly. She looked back toward Marcus, then toward Officer Brooks, then toward the secure operations office again. Without saying another word, she reached for her radio but stopped before pressing the transmit button, choosing instead to place a direct call from her secure phone. As the line began connecting, Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing all along, calm, respectful, and silent, while Officer Brooks continued believing he was still completely in control of a situation that had already begun slipping beyond anything he could possibly imagine. Sarah Collins lowered her voice as she listened carefully to the secure call, making certain that nobody standing nearby could hear the conversation. Her expression remained professional, but the confidence she normally carried had been replaced by unmistakable concern. She ended the call with only 2 words. "Understood, sir." Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked toward Marcus Carter once again. Everything she had just heard confirmed one thing. This situation was no longer an ordinary airport security matter. Before she could step forward, Officer Ethan Brooks spoke again, completely unaware that events were already moving beyond his authority. "I am not finished here," he declared. "Until I get satisfactory answers, you are staying exactly where you are." Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. "I understand your position, officer." Brooks frowned. "Do you?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." That calm response somehow irritated Brooks more than an argument would have. He had expected frustration, complaints, or demands to speak with a supervisor. Instead, Marcus continued offering nothing except respect and cooperation. Brooks looked around, noticing several travelers still quietly watching. Some had lowered their phones, but none of them had walked away. The unusual encounter had become impossible to ignore. Determined to reassert his control, Brooks addressed Marcus in a louder voice. "For now, I am instructing you to remain in the inspection area while I complete additional verification." Marcus answered immediately. "I will comply." Brooks gestured toward a nearby waiting chair position beside the inspection table. "Please have a seat." Marcus calmly placed his duffel bag beside the chair and sat down exactly as instructed, folding his hands loosely in front of him. His posture remained straight without appearing tense. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed appointment rather than someone surrounded by uncertainty. The older Army veteran quietly watched from several yards away and slowly shook his head. He recognized that posture. It belonged to someone who had learned that composure often spoke louder than explanation. Sarah Collins finally approached Brooks. "Officer, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Brooks barely turned his head. "Whatever you need to say, you can say here." Sarah kept her voice measured. "I believe it would be better if we stepped aside." Brooks smiled confidently. "There is nothing complicated about this situation." Sarah hesitated for only a second before answering. "I respectfully disagree." Brooks dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "I will finish my investigation first." Sarah studied his face, realizing that pushing the issue in front of everyone would likely make matters worse. She quietly stepped back while reaching for her radio once more. At that exact moment, the secure telephone inside the operations office rang again. The Transportation Security Administration supervisor answered almost immediately. His expression changed before he spoke a single word. "Yes, sir," he replied. "She is here now." He handed the receiver directly to Sarah as she entered the office. She listened silently, speaking only when necessary. "Yes, General. He is safe." "Yes, sir." "Understood. We will ensure that nothing changes until your representatives arrive." When the call ended, Sarah inhaled slowly, fully understanding the weight of what she had just been told. She returned to the terminal with renewed urgency, but maintained a calm appearance. Marcus remained seated exactly where Brooks had instructed him to wait. He glanced once toward the departure board, noticing that boarding for his flight had nearly finished. Even then, he showed no frustration. Brooks interpreted that silence as surrender. "Looks like you are going to miss your flight," he remarked with a faint smile. Marcus answered quietly. "Some responsibilities are more important than schedules." Brooks crossed his arms. "You still have not told me what those responsibilities are." Marcus replied with the same steady voice that had never once changed throughout the morning. "Because they are not mine alone." The answer settled over the gathering crowd like a question nobody could solve. Sarah stopped several feet away and looked first at Marcus, then at Brooks. She knew exactly what was coming next, but protocol required her to wait only a little longer. Somewhere beyond the secured entrance to the terminal, vehicles had already been dispatched, official notifications had already been issued, and people with far greater authority were already on their way. The balance of power had shifted completely, yet only Marcus seemed to understand that the turning point had already arrived. The atmosphere inside the terminal changed in ways that most travelers could not explain. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarms sounded. No one raised a voice. Yet people instinctively sensed that the ordinary rhythm of the airport had quietly shifted. Sarah Collins stood near the operations office entrance, watching the secure hallway beyond the public terminal with growing focus. Every few seconds, she checked the time, then looked back toward Marcus Carter, who remained seated exactly where Officer Ethan Brooks had instructed him to wait. Marcus appeared completely at peace. He sat with his hands resting loosely together, his duffel bag beside his chair, showing neither frustration nor impatience despite knowing that his scheduled departure had already come and gone. Brooks noticed Marcus glance briefly toward the departure board and interpreted the moment as disappointment. "Looks like your plane is gone," he said with quiet satisfaction. Marcus looked back at him and answered calmly, "Flights can be rescheduled. Character cannot." The sentence was spoken without accusation or sarcasm. It sounded less like a response and more like a principle Marcus had lived by for many years. Brooks folded his arms again. "You always talk like that." Marcus smiled politely. "Only when someone asks me a question." Several nearby travelers exchanged faint smiles, but nobody laughed aloud. The tension remained too heavy for that. Sarah took another call through her secure earpiece, listening silently before answering in a low voice. "Yes, General. We understand. The location has been secured. He remains safe. We will maintain the current conditions until your team arrives." She ended the call and looked toward the main entrance reserved for authorized government vehicles. Her heartbeat quickened. She had managed emergencies, weather evacuations, and security incidents throughout her career, but she had never personally received direct instructions from officials at that level. Inside the Transportation Security Administration office, supervisors quietly informed several employees that a restricted federal response was in progress. They were instructed not to discuss the situation with passengers and to continue normal operations as much as possible. Even so, whispers slowly spread among airport personnel. Something significant was happening. Nobody knew exactly what, but everyone understood it involved the quiet traveler waiting near the inspection area. The older Army veteran remained seated across the terminal, observing Marcus with growing respect. After several minutes, he slowly stood and walked closer. Stopping a respectful distance away, he looked at Marcus and said softly, "Son, I have met a lot of service members over the years. You carry yourself like someone who has seen more than most people ever will." Marcus looked up with genuine warmth. "Thank you, sir." The veteran smiled. "Whatever happens next, keep carrying yourself exactly the way you are now." Marcus nodded once. "I intend to." Brooks watched the exchange, but said nothing. Deep inside, a small voice urged him to reconsider everything that had happened that morning. He ignored it. He had invested too much confidence in his own judgment to step back now. A few moments later, Sarah's radio crackled quietly. She listened for only a second before responding. "Copy. Escort them directly through the secured entrance." She turned toward Brooks immediately. "Officer Brooks, I need to speak with you." Brooks looked at her without moving. "Can it wait?" Sarah answered firmly, "No, it cannot." Before Brooks could reply, several people standing near the large terminal windows noticed a small convoy of dark government vehicles approaching an otherwise restricted entrance beside the airport operations building. The vehicles displayed no flashing lights, no dramatic markings, and made no unnecessary spectacle. Their quiet arrival somehow felt even more significant. Airport employees who recognized the authorization placards immediately stepped aside. Brooks followed everyone's gaze toward the windows. "Who is that?" he asked. Sarah did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Marcus. For the first time since the morning began, Marcus slowly rose from his chair, adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, and stood with the same composed posture he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only quiet readiness. The terminal doors opened, and several senior military officials entered with calm, deliberate confidence. Leading them was General Daniel Whitmore. Without hesitation, without looking toward anyone else first, the general walked directly across the terminal toward Marcus Carter, while every conversation in the surrounding area faded into complete silence. General Daniel Whitmore crossed the polished terminal floor with steady, deliberate steps, followed by several senior military officials whose calm professionalism immediately changed the atmosphere around them. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised a voice. Their quiet confidence carried more authority than any display ever could. Travelers instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without being asked. Officer Ethan Brooks watched with growing confusion as the general ignored every airport official standing nearby and walked directly toward Marcus Carter. Sarah Collins straightened her posture the moment the general approached, offering a respectful greeting before stepping back. Without hesitation, General Whitmore extended his hand. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Carter," he said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Thank you for your patience." Marcus accepted the handshake with quiet respect. "Good morning, General." The simple exchange transformed the entire terminal. Conversations stopped completely. Several Transportation Security Administration employees looked at one another in disbelief. The older Army veteran lowered his head for a brief moment, almost smiling to himself, as though every instinct he had trusted that morning had just been confirmed. Brooks stood frozen. He repeated the words silently in his own mind. "Chief Petty Officer. General." None of it matched the assumptions he had carried only minutes earlier. General Whitmore turned toward Brooks, his expression calm but unmistakably serious. "Officer, I understand you have been speaking with Chief Carter." Brooks nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. We were conducting additional verification." The general acknowledged the answer with a slight nod. Verification is an important responsibility. Professional judgment is equally important. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but found no immediate words. General Whitmore looked back at Marcus. Chief Carter was traveling under active federal authorization connected to a mission requiring protected handling. Appropriate notifications had already been entered into the system before his arrival. Sarah Collins quietly lowered her eyes. She now understood why the authorization code had immediately triggered secure communication protocols. The Transportation Security Administration supervisor, standing nearby, also realized that every restricted notice he had encountered had been entirely legitimate. Marcus had never exaggerated his position. In fact, he had revealed as little as possible while remaining completely truthful from the beginning. General Whitmore continued speaking with measured clarity. Throughout this entire encounter, Chief Carter complied with every lawful instruction given to him. He answered every question he was authorized to answer and declined only information protected by federal responsibility. He paused briefly before adding, "That is exactly what he was expected to do." Brooks looked toward Marcus for the first time without suspicion. He searched the calm face standing before him, perhaps hoping to find anger, resentment, or satisfaction. Instead, he found only quiet composure. Marcus had not celebrated being proven right. He had not embarrassed anyone. He had simply waited for the truth to arrive. The general reached into a document folder carried by one of his aides and removed an official credential packet. Although the contents remained private, the insignia visible on the cover was enough for several veterans in the terminal to recognize that Marcus served in a role demanding extraordinary trust. General Whitmore handed the packet back to his aide before addressing Marcus once more. "Your transportation has been updated. Your assignment schedule has already been adjusted." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, General. Your delay will not affect the mission." Marcus answered with a slight smile. "I appreciate that, sir." Sarah Collins quietly exhaled, realizing the morning could have unfolded very differently had Marcus responded with frustration instead of discipline. The older Army veteran slowly approached Marcus after receiving a nod of approval from one of the military officials. "I knew there was something about the way you carried yourself," he said warmly. Marcus smiled. "Thank you for your service, sir." The veteran's eyes brightened. "And thank you for yours." Around them, the crowd remained silent, not because they had witnessed power, but because they had witnessed character. Every calm answer Marcus had given suddenly carried new meaning. Every respectful response returned to their memories one sentence at a time. He had never claimed to be important. He had never demanded special treatment. He had simply refused to compromise either his duty or his dignity. Standing in the center of the terminal, surrounded by travelers who only moments earlier had seen an ordinary passenger, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Carter looked exactly the same as he had when he first entered the airport that morning. The only thing that had changed was that everyone else had finally learned who he truly was. The silence that settled over the terminal felt heavier than any announcement echoing through the airport. Officer Ethan Brooks remained where he stood, his confidence slowly giving way to the unmistakable realization that the morning had unfolded very differently than he had believed. General Daniel Whitmore looked toward him with the calm expression of someone interested only in facts, not emotion. "Officer Brooks," the general began, "this is not a discussion about military rank. This is a discussion about professional conduct." Brooks swallowed before answering. "General, I believed I was following procedure." General Whitmore nodded slightly. "Every officer has both the authority and the responsibility to verify information when circumstances require it. That responsibility must always be exercised with fairness, respect, and sound judgment." No accusation entered his voice. No anger appeared on his face. Yet every word carried unmistakable weight. Sarah Collins stood quietly beside the general, understanding that the conversation had moved beyond airport operations and into official accountability. One of the military legal advisors stepped forward and handed General Whitmore a sealed folder containing documented timelines, communication records, and verification logs that had already been assembled while the encounter unfolded. The general reviewed only the first page before closing it again. The authorization connected to Chief Carter's travel was validated through secure federal channels before my arrival, he explained. Those records will now become part of the official review. Brooks lowered his eyes briefly. He understood what those words meant. This was no longer about assumptions made in the moment. Every decision would now be examined according to established policy. Two senior officials from Brooks's own department entered the terminal after being notified through the appropriate chain of command. Their arrival was quiet, professional, and respectful. One of them approached Brooks with a measured expression. "Officer Brooks," he said, "effective immediately, you are being relieved from duty pending an administrative review. Please surrender your department credentials for standard processing." Brooks looked at the supervisor for several long seconds before slowly removing his badge and identification wallet. He handed them over without argument. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The crowd remained silent because the moment did not feel like a victory over a person. It felt like the system reminding everyone that authority always carries responsibility. Marcus Carter watched the exchange without satisfaction. His expression never changed. General Whitmore turned toward him. "Chief Carter, if you wish to provide a formal statement later, arrangements will be made." Marcus answered respectfully. "I will cooperate fully, General." The general nodded. "Thank you." Brooks finally looked directly at Marcus. The certainty that had filled his voice earlier that morning had disappeared. "Chief Carter," he said quietly, "if my actions caused unnecessary difficulty, I regret that." Marcus held his gaze for a brief moment before responding. "Every professional has difficult days, officer. What matters is what we choose to learn from them." There was no bitterness in his voice, no attempt to embarrass the man standing before him. The words carried the quiet strength that had defined every decision Marcus made throughout the morning. The older Army veteran, listening nearby, smiled gently and lowered his head with respect. Sarah Collins felt the tension finally begin to leave the terminal. Travelers slowly returned to their gates. Conversations resumed, and rolling suitcases once again became the loudest sound across the polished floor. Yet almost everyone who had witnessed the encounter glanced back at Marcus one last time before leaving. They no longer saw an anonymous traveler. They saw a man who had answered disrespect with discipline and uncertainty with dignity. General Whitmore stepped beside Marcus once more. "Transportation is ready whenever you are." Marcus picked up his duffel bag and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. Before taking a single step, he looked once across the terminal where ordinary passengers continued beginning ordinary journeys. Then he quietly said, "Respect is never protected by a title. It is protected by the choices people make when nobody knows who you are." No one answered because no answer was necessary. The lesson had already reached everyone who had been there to witness it. Marcus Carter walked beside General Daniel Whitmore toward the secured exit with the same steady pace he had maintained since entering the airport that morning. Nothing about him suggested triumph. He did not look back to measure anyone's reaction. He did not pause to enjoy the attention that had suddenly surrounded him. His quiet confidence remained unchanged because it had never depended on recognition. Outside the terminal, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting warm light across the waiting government vehicles. Airport employees continued their work, travelers hurried toward connecting flights, and life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet those who had witnessed the events inside carried something new with them. They had seen how quickly assumptions could replace facts, and how easily dignity could be overlooked until the truth finally appeared. Before stepping into the vehicle, Marcus noticed the older Army veteran making his way toward the exit. The veteran stopped a respectful distance away and extended his hand. Marcus accepted it warmly. "I hope you have a safe journey," the veteran said. Marcus smiled. "Thank you, sir. And thank you again for your service." The veteran chuckled softly. "Today reminded me that this country is still protected by people who do not need recognition to do the right thing." Marcus answered with a simple nod. The mission has never been about being recognized. General Whitmore waited patiently, allowing the conversation to finish before speaking. "Chief Carter, the aircraft has been held for your arrival. Your team has already been informed that you are on your way." Marcus replied, "Thank you, General." As they prepared to leave, Sarah Collins stepped forward. "Chief Carter," she said sincerely, "on behalf of the airport, I apologize for what you experienced today." Marcus looked at her with genuine kindness. "You treated the situation with professionalism. Thank you for doing your job." Those few words visibly eased the weight she had been carrying since the encounter began. Inside the terminal, Officer Ethan Brooks quietly completed the administrative process requested by his supervisors. He remained silent, replaying every conversation in his mind. For the first time that morning, he understood that the greatest mistake had not been asking questions. It had been allowing assumptions to shape the way he treated another human being before the facts were known. No public humiliation could teach that lesson as clearly as the truth already had. Across the terminal, several travelers resumed their journeys, but many continued discussing the remarkable calm displayed by the quiet man who never demanded special treatment. Parents explained the moment to their children in simple words. A businessman who had recorded part of the encounter quietly deleted the video from his phone, deciding that some lessons were more valuable when remembered than when shared for attention. The little girl whose stuffed rabbit Marcus had returned earlier looked through the terminal window just in time to see him entering the government vehicle. She waved enthusiastically even though she knew he probably could not see her. Marcus happened to glance back at that exact moment. He smiled and raised his hand in return before stepping inside. The vehicle pulled away without sirens, without celebration, and without drawing unnecessary attention. It disappeared into the steady flow of airport traffic as though it had simply become another part of an ordinary day. Yet everyone who had witnessed the morning understood that it had been anything but ordinary. They had watched authority meet humility. They had watched assumptions collapse under the weight of truth. Most importantly, they had watched a man protect his dignity without raising his voice, without seeking revenge, and without forgetting the values he had spent a lifetime defending. Long after the terminal returned to normal, people would remember not the uniform, not the rank, and not the official convoy waiting outside. They would remember the quiet traveler who answered every moment of doubt with patience, every moment of disrespect with composure, and every moment of uncertainty with unwavering character. Because in the end, badges can be removed, titles can change, and power can pass from one person to another, but honor belongs forever to those who choose integrity when nobody is watching, and that is the kind of strength no one can ever take away.